My name is Meredith Collins, and I am 32 years old. The moment my brother Wesley stood up at Thanksgiving dinner, raised his glass, and announced to 20 family members that I was likely a lesbian who could not get a man, I wanted to disappear. His girlfriend Tiffany laughed like he had told the funniest joke in the world. My Aunt Geraldine nodded in agreement. My own mother looked away and said nothing to defend me. But what happened next changed everything. When I went to grab my coat from the closet, I discovered something on Wesley's phone that would expose a betrayal far worse than public humiliation. Before we continue this story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below, because I love connecting with people from all over the world. If you have ever been mocked or underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you, hit that like button right now and let me know you understand this pain. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. What I discovered in that coat closet would change my entire life. And trust me, you will want to see what happens when the truth finally comes out. The dining room felt suffocating as Wesley's cruel words echoed in my ears. 20 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions ranging from pity to poorly concealed amusement. I could feel the heat rushing to my cheeks, but I had spent years building a career as a veterinarian in Austin, Texas, and I knew how to stay calm under pressure. I pushed back my chair with deliberate slowness and announced that I needed some fresh air. My voice remained steady even though my heart was shattering into 1,000 pieces. As I walked toward the hallway, whispers erupted behind me like a swarm of angry bees. Someone mentioned that Wesley had always been the successful one, while I was just the spinster who preferred animals to people. Another voice, which I recognized as Aunt Geraldine's sharp tone, declared it was no wonder I remained single with my cold and unfriendly attitude. I kept my head high and continued walking across the hardwood floors that I had helped my mother polish every holiday season when I was a child. This house where I had grown up, where I had learned to ride a bicycle, where my father had taught me to throw a baseball before cancer stole him from us, now felt like hostile territory. I was nearly at the front door when a gentle hand touched my shoulder. Turning around, I found my cousin Rachel standing there with genuine concern written across her face. She pulled me into a warm embrace and whispered that Wesley was being such a jerk and that she was so sorry for what he had said. I hugged her back, feeling grateful that at least one person in this family seemed to care about my feelings. But even as I held her, something strange nagged at me. I noticed her eyes darting toward the dining room, toward where Wesley sat looking smug and satisfied. At that moment, I dismissed my suspicion as paranoia born from hurt feelings. Looking back now, I wish I had trusted my instincts. Rachel asked if I was going to be okay, and I lied and told her I just needed to grab my coat and leave before I said something I would regret. She nodded sympathetically and squeezed my hand before returning to the dining room. I watched her go, then turned toward the coat closet near the front entrance. The closet was packed with winter jackets, scarves, and coats from all 20 guests, and I had to dig through several layers to find my own black peacoat buried near the back. That was when I heard it. A buzzing sound coming from somewhere in the pile of coats beside mine. I pushed aside a leather jacket that I recognized as Wesley's expensive designer purchase from last Christmas and discovered his phone lighting up in the pocket. The screen was visible through the thin material, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. A notification from his banking app displayed in bold letters, "Transfer successful. $15,000 from Patricia Collins to Wesley Collins." Patricia Collins was our mother, who was supposedly too sick to manage her own finances. Our mother who had told me just last month that money was too tight to help me expand my veterinary clinic. My hands trembled as I carefully extracted the phone from his pocket. The screen remained unlocked, revealing dozens of recent transactions all originating from our mother's accounts and flowing into Wesley's. The amounts were staggering, totaling what appeared to be hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred over the past several months. Beside Wesley's phone, I spotted another device with a sparkly pink case that I recognized as Tiffany's. Her screen showed a text message thread discussing something called the plan and how everything was proceeding perfectly according to schedule. Without hesitation, I pulled out my own phone and began frantically capturing screenshots of everything I could access. My heart pounded so violently I could barely breathe, but I forced my hands to remain steady as I documented bank statements, text messages, and what appeared to be forged signature documents. When I returned to the dining room to make my excuses and leave, I observed my brother and his girlfriend through completely different eyes. Wesley lounged in his chair, laughing at something Aunt Geraldine had said, while his arm draped possessively around Tiffany's shoulders. My mother sat at the far end of the table looking frail and strangely disconnected from everything happening around her. Now I noticed the glassy, unfocused quality of her gaze that I had previously attributed to her cancer treatments. Now I observed how Tiffany kept refilling Mom's wine glass even though she barely touched alcohol anymore because of her medications. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They were drugging my mother. They were stealing from her. And they had publicly humiliated me to ensure that if I ever tried to expose them, nobody would believe a word I said. I left that Thanksgiving dinner claiming a work emergency at my clinic, and nobody seemed particularly disappointed to see me go. As I drove through the Austin streets toward my apartment, I struggled to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. My own brother, the boy I had grown up with, the teenager I had defended countless times when he got into trouble, was systematically robbing our dying mother while poisoning her against me. The next morning confirmed my worst fears. I received a phone call from Dr. Patterson, my mother's physician, who sounded distinctly uncomfortable as he informed me that my mother had called his office to remove me from her emergency contact list. But that was not all. The doctor hesitantly explained that my mother had accused me of stealing from her and said she no longer trusted me with access to her medical information. I stood frozen in my kitchen, barely able to process what I was hearing. I asked if he was certain it was actually my mother who made that call, and he confirmed she had sounded tired but coherent. I knew immediately that Wesley had already begun his campaign to frame me as the villain. Throughout that entire day, I tried calling my mother repeatedly, but the phone just rang endlessly without answer. Around 7 that evening, a text message arrived from Wesley. It read, "Stay away from Mom. We know what you have been doing." Standing alone in my empty apartment holding my phone, I finally understood the full scope of what I was facing. This was not simple sibling rivalry or petty jealousy. This was a coordinated attack designed to destroy my reputation, while my brother systematically stole everything our mother possessed. And I had absolutely no idea how to stop him. 3 agonizing days passed without any contact from my mother despite my numerous attempts to reach her. Every call went straight to voicemail. Every text message remained unread. My worry grew so unbearable that I finally decided to drive to the family home and demand to see her in person. The December air was crisp and cold as I pulled into the familiar driveway, and I immediately noticed changes. A new security camera had been mounted above the front door that definitely was not there during Thanksgiving dinner. I walked up to the porch with my heart hammering against my ribs and tried to insert my key into the lock. It would not turn. They had changed all the locks on my childhood home without telling me. I pressed the doorbell and waited, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened just a few inches, and Tiffany's face appeared in the narrow gap. She was wearing one of my mother's expensive silk robes, the burgundy one Dad had given her for their 20th anniversary, and her smile was sweet as honey, while her eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. She informed me in her syrupy southern accent that Patricia did not want to see me today because I had upset her terribly at Thanksgiving, and she needed rest. I demanded to see my mother immediately, told Tiffany she had absolutely no right to keep me from my own family. That was when Wesley materialized behind her, his handsome face twisted with self-righteous anger. He told me to leave before they called the police, said I had heard what Tiffany told me and I was not welcome here anymore. I begged him to tell me what was happening, asked him why he was doing this, but he just stared at me with pure hatred burning in his eyes. He said I knew exactly what I had done, and that they were protecting Mom from my toxic influence now. I wanted desperately to confront him about the money, to throw the screenshots in his face, but something held me back. I did not have enough evidence yet to prove anything, and I did not know who else might be involved in his scheme. So I stood there on the porch of the house where I had spent my entire childhood, where I had carved pumpkins with my father and baked cookies with my mother, and I watched helplessly as my brother slammed the door in my face. The neighbors were watching everything. I could see curtains twitching in the house across the street, could feel judgmental eyes boring into my back as I walked with as much dignity as I could muster back to my car. The humiliation of that moment burned far worse than anything Wesley had said at Thanksgiving dinner. That evening, the family group chat exploded with activity. Aunt Geraldine posted a lengthy message claiming I had tried to break into my mother's house and had been screaming like a lunatic and causing a terrible scene. She declared she had always known something was wrong with me, and that our father's death had clearly affected my mental stability in ways that required professional intervention. Then she dropped a bombshell that nearly destroyed me. She announced she had heard from reliable sources that I had developed a serious drug problem, and that explained why I was still single and acting so erratically. I stared at my phone screen in utter disbelief, as other family members began chiming in with their concerns. Cousins I had not spoken to in years suddenly had strong opinions about my mental health and personal life. An uncle suggested I should check myself into a rehabilitation facility, and through all of this coordinated character assassination, Wesley and Tiffany remained conspicuously silent, allowing others to do their dirty work while they kept their hands clean. Then a private message notification appeared from Rachel. She claimed she had tried to defend me in the group chat, but nobody would listen to her. She asked probing questions about what I planned to do next, whether I had evidence of anything, whether I was considering going to the police. In my desperate need for an ally, I confided some of what I had discovered. I told her about the screenshots, the suspicious bank transfers, my suspicions about my mother being drugged. She expressed horror and sympathy and promised to help however she could. I had no idea that every word I typed was being forwarded directly to Wesley within minutes. 1 week after being banished from my mother's house, the second attack struck without warning. I arrived at my veterinary clinic on a frigid Monday morning to find 2 uniformed police officers waiting for me in the parking lot. They informed me they had received an anonymous tip alleging I was stealing controlled substances from my own practice. I stood there in shock, barely able to form coherent sentences, as they presented a warrant to search the entire premises. I watched helplessly as they methodically went through every cabinet, every drawer, every locked medication safe where I stored the drugs needed to treat my patients. They found absolutely nothing incriminating, because there was nothing to find. But the damage had already been done. Someone had tipped off the local newspaper, and a reporter was photographing the police search from across the street. By that afternoon, an article appeared online with the devastating headline, "Local Veterinarian Under Investigation for Drug Theft." My phone began ringing constantly as clients called to cancel their scheduled appointments. People whose beloved pets I had treated for years suddenly did not trust me anymore. I sat alone in my empty clinic that evening, surrounded by walls covered with thank you cards from grateful pet owners, and I tried to comprehend how my entire life had collapsed so completely in just 2 weeks. Then a detail surfaced in my memory. Tiffany worked for a pharmaceutical company. She would know exactly how to file a credible anonymous complaint about controlled substance theft. She would understand the proper terminology and protocols that would make the tip seem legitimate. This was not random. This was a calculated strike designed to destroy my livelihood and my professional reputation. I sat in my office chair as darkness fell outside my window, and I allowed myself to cry for the first time since this nightmare began. Huge, heaving sobs shook my entire body as I mourned everything that was slipping away. I seriously considered selling my clinic and moving somewhere far away, where nobody knew my name or my family. I could start over in another state, build a new life, let Wesley have whatever he wanted. But then I remembered something my mother used to tell me when I was a child, being tormented by bullies at school. She would cup my face in her gentle hands and say, "Never let them see you fall, sweetheart. You are stronger than they will ever know." My mother had believed in me once, maybe somewhere deep inside, beneath all the drugs they were forcing into her system. She still believed in me now. I could not abandon her to these predators. I wiped my tears with shaking hands, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight back with everything I had. I just needed to figure out exactly how to do it. The first person who came to mind was Nora Patterson, my mother's former home nurse. Nora had worked with Mom for almost 2 years, visiting the house 3 times a week to help with physical therapy and medication management after her first cancer surgery. She had stopped working for our family abruptly about 8 months ago, right around the time Wesley moved back home with Tiffany in tow. At the time, I assumed Mom had simply decided she no longer needed the professional help. Now I wondered if there was a much darker reason for Nora's sudden departure. I tracked her down at a hospice facility on the outskirts of Austin, where she had taken a full-time position. She was a kind-faced woman in her mid-40s with streaks of gray beginning to appear in her dark curly hair and gentle hands that had helped my mother through some of her most difficult days. When she spotted me approaching through the hospice lobby, her expression cycled rapidly through surprise, then genuine concern, then something that looked distinctly like fear. She glanced around nervously and asked what I was doing there in a hushed voice. I told her I desperately needed her help, that I believed something terrible was happening to my mother, and I did not know who else I could trust. Nora led me outside to a private garden area, behind the facility, where we could talk without being overheard. She told me immediately that she could not discuss anything about her time working with my family because they had threatened her. When I asked who exactly had made these threats, she revealed it was Wesley and his girlfriend. They had warned her that if she ever contacted anyone in the family again, they would file complaints claiming she had been stealing medication and her nursing career would be finished. I pleaded with her to tell me what she knew, explaining everything I had discovered at Thanksgiving, the bank transfers, the changed locks, the drugged and confused look in my mother's eyes. Nora listened with growing horror spreading across her face. Finally, she began talking. She told me that when she first started working with my mother, Patricia was sharp as a tack despite her physical weakness from cancer treatment. They would do crossword puzzles together and have long conversations about literature and current events. Then Wesley and Tiffany moved into the house, supposedly to help care for Patricia during her illness. Within just a few weeks, everything began changing. Nora noticed that the medication dosages were being altered without proper documentation. Patricia started sleeping more and more hours each day. She became confused and paranoid. Nothing like her former self. Nora tried repeatedly to report her concerns to Patricia's physician, but Tiffany always seemed to intercept the messages before they could reach him. One day, Nora arrived at the house for her regular shift, and Wesley informed her that her services were no longer required. The very next morning, she received a threatening letter from an attorney warning her against contacting the family. I asked Nora if she would be willing to provide official testimony about everything she had witnessed, and she hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. Then she nodded slowly and said, "Yes, but only if I could guarantee her protection from retaliation." I promised her I would find a way to keep her safe. We exchanged phone numbers, and she provided me with copies of detailed notes she had secretly kept during her final months caring for my mother. Those notes were invaluable. They documented every medication change, every behavioral shift, every suspicious incident she had observed. I finally had something concrete to build my case upon. My next step was finding someone with the expertise to properly investigate this situation. A friend from college who had become a successful attorney recommended a private investigator named Derek Lawson. She described him as former Army intelligence, extremely thorough and discreet, expensive but absolutely worth every penny. I called him that same afternoon and scheduled a meeting for the following morning at his office. Derek's workspace was located in a nondescript building in downtown Austin, and the man himself defied all my expectations of what a private investigator would look like. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered with kind eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around him simultaneously. I sat across from his cluttered desk and poured out the entire story from beginning to end. I told him about the Thanksgiving humiliation, the phone discoveries, the locked doors, the police search of my clinic, everything. I showed him all the screenshots I had captured, and Nora's handwritten notes. He listened without interrupting once, occasionally jotting something in a worn leather notebook. When I finally finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He warned me that family cases were notoriously messy and emotionally draining. He asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed down this road, knowing what it might cost me. I told him my mother was dying while being drugged and systematically robbed by her own son. I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. Something in my voice or my expression must have convinced him because he nodded once and agreed to take my case. He cautioned that the investigation would require time and patience, and that I needed to be extremely careful about who I trusted. I agreed to his terms and his substantial fee, knowing it would drain most of my savings but also knowing I had no other choice. Derek commenced his investigation immediately, and within just 1 week, he had unearthed information that chilled me to my core. Wesley owed over $200,000 to extremely dangerous loan sharks connected to his gambling addiction. He had been concealing a severe gambling problem for years, losing astronomical sums at underground poker games, and his creditors were now threatening violence if he did not pay up soon. But that horrifying discovery was not even the worst of it. Tiffany Marsh was not who she claimed to be at all. Derek uncovered records showing she had operated under at least 3 completely different identities in various states across the country. Her real name appeared to be Crystal something, though he was still working to confirm the exact details. In each of her previous identities, she had become romantically involved with wealthy older individuals, often those with serious health conditions. One of them, an elderly widower in Louisiana, had died under highly suspicious circumstances, barely 3 months after adding her to his will. This was not simply theft or financial exploitation. Tiffany was a professional predator who deliberately targeted vulnerable people for their money, and possibly their lives. She had set her sights on my mother as her next victim. The revelation was absolutely horrifying, but at least now I understood exactly what kind of monster I was dealing with. Derek and I developed a careful plan to gather more evidence, and part of that strategy involved testing my trusted contacts to identify any potential leaks. He instructed me to plant different pieces of false information with different people and see which fabrications made their way back to Wesley. It was a classic intelligence technique for identifying moles. I chose Rachel as one of my primary tests without telling her anything was amiss. In what I made sound like a moment of exhausted vulnerability, I confided that I had secretly opened a bank account in Dallas, where I was moving all my remaining money in case Wesley tried to freeze my assets. The information was completely invented, but I delivered it convincingly with appropriate anxiety. Within exactly 24 hours, Wesley sent me a threatening text message demanding to know about the secret account in Dallas and warning me that hiding assets was illegal. My stomach plummeted when I read his words. Rachel, my cousin who had embraced me with such apparent sympathy at Thanksgiving, who had sent me supportive private messages, who had asked all those concerned questions about my plans and evidence, had been feeding every detail directly to Wesley from the very beginning. I thought about all the sensitive information I had shared with her, all the strategic details I had revealed because I trusted her completely. The depth of her betrayal cut far deeper than anything Wesley had ever done, because I had genuinely believed she cared about me. Now that I knew Rachel was operating as a mole for Wesley's camp, Derek and I decided to weaponize her betrayal against them. Instead of confronting her and alerting Wesley that we were onto her, I would continue feeding her carefully crafted false information while we built our real case in secret. The first piece of strategic disinformation was designed to make Wesley feel completely safe and in control. I told Rachel during a tearful phone call that I was exhausted beyond belief and simply could not fight anymore. I confided that I was planning to leave Texas entirely and start fresh somewhere on the West Coast, maybe Portland or Seattle where I had friends from veterinary school. I made my voice crack at all the right moments, made it sound like I had given up completely, like Wesley had achieved total victory. Rachel made all the appropriate sympathetic noises and assured me she completely understood that sometimes walking away was the healthiest choice a person could make. I could practically hear the excitement bubbling beneath her fake concern as we spoke. She could not wait to hang up and report back to Wesley that his troublesome sister was finally throwing in the towel. Sure enough, Derek's surveillance confirmed that Wesley and Tiffany immediately relaxed their vigilance after receiving Rachel's report. They started going out more frequently, spending money more lavishly, and leaving my mother alone in the house for increasingly longer periods. They believed with absolute certainty that they had won. That overconfidence would become their first critical mistake. With Wesley and Tiffany planning a weekend getaway to a casino resort in Louisiana, I recognized my opportunity to see my mother might never be better. Nora still remembered the security codes for the house because Tiffany had never bothered to change them after firing her so abruptly. It was an enormous risk, but I had to try. I drove to my childhood home late on a Saturday night, with my heart pounding so violently I could feel it throbbing in my throat. Nora met me at the back door and quickly entered the code to disable the alarm system. The house was dark and utterly silent as we crept upstairs toward my mother's bedroom. What I discovered in that room nearly shattered me completely. My mother lay in her bed looking barely conscious, her breathing shallow and labored, surrounded by countless prescription bottles covering every available surface. The room smelled stale and sickly, and legal documents were scattered carelessly across her nightstand that appeared to be property transfers and financial authorizations. I knelt beside her bed and gently took her fragile hand in mine. Her eyes fluttered open, and for several heartbeats she seemed not to recognize me at all. Then a tiny spark of clarity entered her clouded gaze, and she whispered my name in a voice so weak I could barely hear it. She told me she knew I would come eventually, that somewhere deep inside she had never stopped believing in me. I asked her to tell me what they had been doing to her, and she struggled visibly to focus her thoughts. She explained haltingly that they kept making her sign papers, but she could not understand what the documents said, because the words blurred together. She said they gave her medicine constantly that made everything fuzzy and confused. She revealed that Wesley had told her I had abandoned her, that I was stealing from her accounts, that I hated her for getting sick and becoming a burden. Tears streamed down my face as I listened to my mother describe how my own brother had systematically poisoned her mind against me. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and began frantically documenting everything. I photographed every pill bottle, every legal document, the deplorable condition of the room. Then I asked my mother to tell me everything she could remember while I recorded her shaky voice. Her testimony was fragmented and confused, but it was something tangible. It was proof that she was being coerced. We were so completely focused on documenting evidence that we almost failed to hear the car pulling into the driveway below. Nora rushed to the window and whispered urgently that Tiffany's distinctive car had returned. She must have forgotten something and come back unexpectedly from the casino. I grabbed my phone and looked around desperately for somewhere to conceal myself. Nora pushed me firmly toward the large closet in the corner of the bedroom and instructed me not to make a single sound no matter what happened. I squeezed behind my mother's winter coats and formal dresses, just as I heard the front door opening downstairs. Footsteps ascending the staircase. My heart was hammering so loudly, I was convinced Tiffany would hear it the moment she entered the room. Through the narrow gap between the closet doors, I watched her stride into the bedroom, without even glancing at my mother lying helpless in her bed. She headed straight for the dresser to retrieve a designer purse she had apparently left behind. Then her phone rang and she answered it casually while digging through the purse for something. From my hiding place, I heard her say clearly that the old bat should be dead by Christmas if they kept up the current medication schedule. She laughed at something the caller said, then mentioned casually that the Caribbean would be lovely that time of year for their celebratory vacation. I had to physically clamp my hand over my own mouth to keep from gasping aloud. She was discussing my mother's death with the same casual tone someone might use to plan a dinner party. I fumbled desperately with my phone in the darkness, praying that I was successfully recording the conversation. Tiffany finished her call and dropped the phone back into her purse. Then she walked directly toward the closet. I pressed myself back against the wall so hard I could feel the plaster against my spine, holding my breath until my lungs burned. She reached into the closet and grabbed a jacket from a hanger positioned just inches from my face. For one eternal moment, she paused and seemed to look directly at where I was hiding. Then she turned and walked briskly out of the room, calling out that she would be back in a few hours. The front door slammed shut, and I finally allowed myself to breathe again. That recording should have been enough evidence to stop them immediately. I had captured clear proof of criminal intent, evidence of systematic drugging, documentation of financial exploitation. But exactly when I believed I was finally getting ahead, Wesley executed a devastating countermaneuver. 3 days after my secret visit to see my mother, I received formal court documents delivered by a process server. Wesley had filed for an emergency restraining order against me, claiming in sworn statements that I had explicitly threatened to kill our mother in order to accelerate my inheritance. He had multiple witnesses supporting his allegations. Aunt Geraldine and Rachel had both provided signed affidavits claiming under oath that they had personally heard me make violent threats against my mother's life during family gatherings. The restraining order prohibited me from approaching within 500 feet of my mother's residence or contacting her through any means whatsoever. If I violated the order even once, I would be immediately arrested and jailed. My attorney, Margaret, a sharp-minded woman Derek had recommended, examined the documents with growing concern. She told me bluntly that this situation looked extremely bad from a legal perspective. Wesley had filed for emergency protection based on serious elder abuse concerns, and the court was treating the allegations with appropriate gravity. She assured me we could fight the order, but in the meantime I was legally forbidden from any contact with my own dying mother. I sat in Margaret's office, feeling the walls closing in around me from every direction. Every time I believed I had made progress, Wesley somehow managed to stay multiple steps ahead. He controlled the legal system, dominated the family narrative, and commanded public opinion entirely in his favor. And I was rapidly exhausting every option available to me. The fourth attack arrived in the form of a primetime evening news broadcast. I was sitting in my nearly deserted clinic, desperately trying to salvage what remained of my veterinary practice, when one of my few remaining staff members burst into my office and told me I needed to see the television immediately. She pointed at the screen mounted on the break room wall, and there was Wesley's face filling the screen. He looked appropriately concerned and heartbroken as he spoke emotionally to an interviewer about his troubled family situation. He described with apparent sorrow how his mentally unstable sister had been attempting to steal from their dying mother for many months. He mentioned with feigned reluctance that she had well-documented mental health issues and possibly a serious substance abuse problem, and that the family had tried desperately to get her professional help but she had responded with increasing violence and threats. Tiffany stood faithfully beside him throughout the interview, dabbing delicately at her eyes with a tissue, the perfect picture of a supportive and caring girlfriend who was simply trying to protect a vulnerable elderly woman. She choked back fake tears as she described Patricia as just a sweet old woman who wanted nothing more than to spend her final days surrounded by peace and love. She said it absolutely broke her heart to witness such a defenseless person being victimized by her own flesh and blood. The news graphic displayed my professional headshot from the veterinary clinic website beside bold text reading, "Suspected elder abuse. Every single person watching that broadcast now knew exactly who I was, what I looked like, and where I worked. By the following morning, my entire life had completely disintegrated. The State Veterinary Board announced they were launching a formal investigation into my professional conduct based on the extensive news coverage, and my clinic license was immediately suspended pending the results of their review. I could not legally examine or treat patients, which meant I could not generate any income, which meant I could not pay my mounting bills. Then I received a devastating call from my bank. Someone had filed a fraud report on my accounts using falsified documents, and they were freezing all my assets indefinitely while they conducted a thorough investigation. I could not access a single dollar of my own money. Finally, my landlord appeared at my apartment door with an apologetic expression that did not match the eviction notice in his hand. He explained that he had seen the news coverage, and he simply could not permit that woman to continue living in his building. He gave me exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. In less than 1 week, I had gone from being a respected veterinarian with a thriving practice and a comfortable life to being homeless, unemployed, and publicly branded as a dangerous criminal. I loaded everything I could physically fit into my small car, filling the back seat and trunk with garbage bags stuffed with my possessions, and drove aimlessly to a remote parking lot on the outskirts of the city. I sat there in the driver's seat surrounded by the scattered remnants of my former life, staring blankly at the night sky through my windshield. I thought seriously about just driving away and never stopping. I could escape to somewhere nobody had ever heard my name, somewhere I could vanish completely and rebuild from nothing. Maybe Wesley was right about everything. Maybe I truly was worthless and unlovable. Maybe I could not find a man because there was something fundamentally broken inside me that everyone else could see clearly, but I had never acknowledged. Maybe I deserved every terrible thing that was happening to me. I sat alone in that dark parking lot for over 3 hours, spiraling closer and closer to the edge of complete and utter surrender. Then I forced myself to call Derek. My voice emerged as barely a whisper as I told him I could not continue fighting anymore. They had taken absolutely everything from me and I had nothing left to give. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Derek spoke firmly but gently. He told me they had not taken my mother yet. They had not taken the truth. He commanded me to keep fighting. He reminded me about the recording I had captured of Tiffany casually discussing my mother being dead by Christmas. He emphasized that what I had documented was not merely theft or financial crimes. It was evidence of premeditated murder. I sat up straighter in my cramped driver's seat as his words slowly penetrated my fog of despair. Derek instructed me to come directly to his apartment. He had a spare guest room I could use temporarily, and we had critically important work to accomplish together. I drove across town through the dark, empty streets and arrived at his building exhausted beyond measure. He met me at the door and helped carry my bags inside without a word of judgment about my disheveled appearance. He made me a strong cup of coffee and sat me down at his kitchen table, where files and photographs covered every available surface. We worked through the entire night organizing every piece of evidence we had painstakingly gathered. Derek showed me the results of his continued investigation into Tiffany's true background. Her real name was Crystal Dunn, and she was actively wanted by authorities in Louisiana for elder fraud and strong suspicion of murder. The elderly man who had died so conveniently after adding her to his will had actually been systematically poisoned over a period of several months, following an identical pattern to what was currently happening to my mother. Wesley had no idea whatsoever that he was romantically involved with a serial predator who had likely killed before. He probably believed he was simply partnering with a clever con artist to solve his gambling debt problems. He did not realize that Crystal planned to disappear completely the moment she secured the money, probably leaving him to face all the criminal consequences alone. Derek suggested it was time to escalate our efforts dramatically by contacting the FBI directly. Elder abuse cases that crossed state lines automatically fell under federal jurisdiction, and Crystal Dunn was already prominently on their investigative radar. This was no longer a simple family dispute. This was a sophisticated multi-state criminal conspiracy, and we possessed the evidence necessary to expose it completely. The FBI field office in Austin assigned a senior agent named Morrison to review our case. He was a tall, serious man, with a military-style buzz cut and a no-nonsense demeanor, who had spent 15 years specializing in elder fraud and financial exploitation investigations. When Derek methodically presented all our accumulated evidence, Agent Morrison's skeptical expression gradually transformed into intense professional interest. He revealed that Crystal Dunn was connected to at least 3 suspicious deaths of elderly victims scattered across 4 different states. His team had been attempting to build a prosecutable case against her for years, but she always managed to disappear completely before they could assemble sufficient evidence for an arrest. With the recordings, documents, and witness testimony we had gathered, they finally possessed what they needed to take definitive action. But Agent Morrison warned us that extreme caution was absolutely essential. If Crystal discovered even a hint that the FBI was actively investigating her activities, she would immediately flee, almost certainly taking whatever money she could rapidly transfer with her. They required additional evidence of her current crimes before they could safely move to arrest her. In the meantime, Nora provided investigators with the detailed records she had secretly maintained during her final months caring for my mother. Her documentation showed precisely how Wesley and Tiffany had systematically isolated Patricia from everyone who cared about her, while gradually increasing her medication dosages to dangerous levels. The FBI brought in a medical expert who reviewed the records extensively and confirmed that the pattern was entirely consistent with intentional drugging specifically designed to create cognitive impairment and dependency. Everything was finally falling into place after months of frustrating setbacks, and then Wesley somehow discovered that the FBI had opened an active investigation into his activities. I never learned exactly who provided him this critical information, but Derek strongly suspected Wesley had cultivated a corrupt contact within local law enforcement, who owed him favors from past gambling debts. Whatever the source, Wesley immediately panicked and accelerated his plans dramatically. He filed emergency paperwork seeking immediate legal guardianship over our mother. His petition alleged that Patricia Collins was suffering from severe progressive dementia and was completely incapable of making any decisions for herself. The documents further claimed that I had somehow manipulated our vulnerable mother into providing false statements against her loving son, and that Wesley, as her devoted caretaker who lived with her daily, was the only person capable of adequately protecting her interests. A court hearing was scheduled for exactly 3 days later. If Wesley successfully obtained guardianship, he would gain complete and total legal control over every aspect of my mother's existence. Her medical care, her finances, her living situation, her end-of-life decisions would all rest entirely in his hands. He could relocate her anywhere he chose, absolutely refuse to allow anyone to visit her, and make unilateral decisions about continuing or withdrawing her treatment. More critically, he could systematically destroy every piece of evidence documenting what he and Crystal had done to her. Margaret analyzed the legal situation with obvious concern. She explained that we absolutely had to prove Patricia was being deliberately drugged before that guardianship hearing took place. We needed an independent medical evaluation conducted by physicians with no connection to Wesley, clearly demonstrating that her cognitive impairment was chemically induced rather than natural dementia. The problem was that Wesley had my mother completely locked down. No outside visitors were permitted. No independent medical professionals could access her. No one who was not on his personally approved list could come anywhere near her. The restraining order made any direct approach by me legally impossible. Derek proposed an extremely risky strategy. If we could somehow get my mother transported to a hospital under legitimate emergency circumstances, the physicians there would be legally required to conduct proper medical evaluations, regardless of Wesley's preferences. It was a dangerous long shot with countless ways it could fail catastrophically, but we had completely exhausted our time and conventional options. I agreed to proceed with the plan despite the risks. The first essential step was ensuring Wesley felt absolutely safe and unconcerned about any possible interference. I contacted Rachel and delivered a convincing performance of utter defeat. I told her through manufactured tears that I was finally giving up completely, that I had booked a flight to California, departing the very next day to stay with old friends indefinitely, while I figured out my life. I confessed that I simply could not fight anymore, and wanted only peace and distance from this nightmare. I made my voice tremble convincingly at all the appropriate moments. Rachel expressed what sounded like genuine sympathy, and assured me repeatedly that she believed I was making the wisest possible choice for my mental health. I could almost hear her mentally composing the triumphant message she would send Wesley the instant we ended our call. Sure enough, Derek's surveillance assets confirmed that Wesley and Crystal celebrated extravagantly that same evening. They dined at one of the most expensive restaurants in Austin, ordered multiple bottles of premium champagne, and toasted repeatedly to their complete and total victory over the troublesome sister who had dared to challenge them. They genuinely believed they had permanently eliminated me as a threat. While they luxuriated in their premature celebration, Derek carefully arranged for an ambulance to respond to an anonymous wellness check at my mother's address. The emergency call reported an elderly woman who appeared completely unresponsive and in severe medical distress. By law, the paramedics possessed full authority to enter the home without permission to assess her welfare and provide emergency treatment if necessary. Everything unfolded precisely according to Derek's meticulous predictions. The ambulance arrived with lights flashing and the paramedics knocked firmly on the door. When no one responded after repeated attempts, they exercised their legal authority to enter the premises. They discovered my mother lying in her bed barely conscious, with vital signs indicating potential overdose or dangerous drug interaction. They immediately loaded her onto a stretcher and rushed her toward the hospital for emergency evaluation. Wesley and Crystal pulled into the driveway just as the ambulance was departing with its sirens wailing. They attempted desperately to stop the transfer, insisting loudly that they were her authorized caregivers and that she was perfectly fine and did not need medical attention. But the paramedics followed established protocol without deviation. A potential medical emergency required immediate hospital transport for professional evaluation. There was absolutely nothing Wesley could legally do to prevent it. At the hospital, the emergency room physicians ordered a comprehensive toxicology panel on my mother. The results were absolutely damning. Patricia had dangerously elevated levels of multiple sedatives in her bloodstream, along with several overlapping medications that should never have been prescribed together under any circumstances. The combinations were potentially lethal, with continued administration. The attending physician immediately contacted Adult Protective Services to report suspected elder abuse. Wesley and Crystal were detained and questioned extensively by hospital security personnel and APS investigators, but there was not yet sufficient evidence for immediate arrest, and they were ultimately released, with instructions not to leave the area. However, the emergency restraining order did not apply to hospital facilities. For the first time in many weeks, I was legally permitted to visit my mother. She was lying in a sterile hospital bed, looking impossibly fragile beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting, with tubes and monitoring wires connected throughout her thin body, but her eyes were clearer than I had witnessed in many months. Without the constant chemical sedation suppressing her cognitive functions, her mind was slowly beginning to emerge from the fog. She recognized me instantly the moment I entered her room, and tears began streaming down her papery cheeks. She apologized repeatedly, saying they had convinced her I had abandoned her to die alone. I took her frail hand in both of mine and assured her that none of that mattered anymore. I promised her I was here now and I would never leave her side again. Over the next several hours, with Margaret and a court-certified reporter present to document everything officially, my mother provided a detailed account of everything she could remember happening to her. She described precisely how Wesley and Crystal had controlled every single aspect of her daily existence. She explained how they made her sign documents she could not comprehend through the medication fog, told her vicious lies about me, and kept her perpetually sedated, so she lacked the mental clarity to resist or seek help. She recalled brief moments of lucidity, when she understood something was terribly wrong, but could not maintain her focus long enough to take any action. Every word was recorded and officially notarized. My mother was finally able to tell her truth to people who believed her. Margaret dispatched formal legal notice to Wesley and his attorney, requesting an emergency family meeting to discuss Patricia's estate and ongoing care arrangements. We deliberately presented it as a potential settlement negotiation, an opportunity to resolve the escalating conflict, without expensive and embarrassing further court proceedings. Wesley perceived this as a chance to definitively consolidate his control over the situation. He agreed to attend the meeting, utterly confident that he still maintained the upper hand despite recent setbacks. He arrived at Margaret's law office, accompanied by Crystal, Aunt Geraldine, and Rachel. They walked in looking like a unified front, fully prepared to dismiss whatever desperate arguments I might present. What they absolutely did not expect was FBI agent Morrison and 2 additional federal agents waiting for them inside the conference room. Derek had prepared a comprehensive multimedia presentation that systematically laid out every piece of evidence we had accumulated over the preceding months. He displayed the bank transfers, the medication records, the witness statements, and most devastatingly of all, the crystal-clear recording of Crystal casually discussing my mother being dead by Christmas so they could liquidate everything and escape. The conference room fell into absolute dead silence as Crystal's own voice played through the speakers. She discussed killing my mother with the same casual indifference someone might use discussing weekend travel plans. She mentioned the Caribbean being lovely that time of year for their celebratory getaway. Wesley's face went completely pale as he listened to the recording. He turned slowly toward Crystal, with dawning horror spreading across his features. He had been so desperately focused on obtaining the money he needed to satisfy his threatening gambling creditors that he had never thought to question who he was actually partnering with. He had no idea his girlfriend was a wanted fugitive connected to multiple suspicious deaths in other states. He had not realized she was planning to vanish completely the moment she secured sufficient assets, almost certainly leaving him behind to face all the criminal consequences entirely alone. Crystal attempted to flee. She bolted from her chair and sprinted toward the conference room door, but Agent Morrison moved faster. He caught her arm firmly and announced that Crystal Dunn was under arrest for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and suspicion of murder in connection with 3 separate ongoing federal investigations. She screamed that they were insane, that her name was Tiffany Marsh and she had never heard of Crystal Dunn, but the agents had already confirmed her identity through fingerprints and DNA analysis. They had been patiently building cases against her for many years. Now they finally had her in custody. Wesley was arrested immediately afterward. The charges included elder abuse, felony financial exploitation, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. As the agent secured handcuffs around his wrists, he locked eyes with me across the conference table. For one brief moment, I thought I detected a flicker of genuine remorse in his expression. Then it vanished, replaced immediately by pure, concentrated hatred. He spat that this was far from over, that he would eventually get out and utterly destroy me. Aunt Geraldine remained frozen in her chair throughout the entire confrontation, watching helplessly as everything she believed collapsed into rubble around her. All those years of preferentially favoring Wesley, of believing every lie he told about me, of spreading malicious gossip, of signing false affidavits to help him obtain that restraining order. Now she understood the horrifying truth. She had actively helped an abuser and a murderer systematically destroy his own sister, while their mother was being slowly and deliberately poisoned toward death. I did not waste a single word on her. I did not have to. The devastated expression on her face communicated everything necessary. Finally, I turned to face Rachel directly, my cousin who had embraced me with such convincing warmth at that terrible Thanksgiving dinner. My cousin who had betrayed me from the very beginning, while pretending to be my ally and confidant. She could not meet my eyes no matter how hard she tried. I asked her one simple question. I asked her why. Her answer was utterly pathetic. She explained haltingly that Wesley had promised her a substantial portion of the inheritance in exchange for her cooperation. She had accumulated significant debts and desperately needed the money. She claimed weakly that she never realized the situation was this serious, that she thought it was merely typical family political maneuvering. I stared at her for a long moment, as contempt replaced every trace of love I had once felt. I told her she had betrayed her own family for money, and in the end received nothing at all. I told her she was not family anymore. Then I turned my back on her completely and walked away without another word. As police officers escorted Wesley toward the door, he paused and locked eyes with me one final time. He reminded me with a sneer that I was supposed to be that pathetic lesbian who could not get a man. He said that was what absolutely everyone believed about me. I looked directly at my brother, this man who had publicly humiliated me, stolen from our dying mother, attempted to destroy my career and my reputation and my entire life. And I smiled with genuine satisfaction. I told him that he had called me a lesbian who could not get a man, but now he was a convicted criminal who could not make bail. I observed that it was funny how quickly things can change. He was still screaming incoherent threats as they dragged him away. The weeks immediately following the arrests were an exhausting whirlwind of legal proceedings, court testimony, and extensive media attention. The local news stations ran entirely new stories, dramatically different from their previous coverage. The updated headlines proclaimed, "Daughter exposes elder abuse scheme, saves mother from criminal conspiracy." My name was completely cleared in public, and the veterinary board promptly dropped their investigation and restored my license. Slowly but steadily, clients began returning to my practice. They apologized sincerely for ever doubting me, for canceling their appointments, for believing the orchestrated lies. I accepted their apologies gracefully, and focused all my energy on rebuilding what I had lost. My mother was transferred to a legitimate medical facility where she could receive proper care from healthcare professionals who genuinely wanted to help her recover. Without the constant chemical sedation suppressing her brain function, her mental clarity returned almost completely within several weeks. She would never be quite as strong as she was before the abuse began. The cancer and months of deliberate poisoning had exacted a permanent toll on her body, but she was herself again, sharp and loving and fully present. I visited her every single day without exception, and we spent countless hours talking, laughing together, and crying in each other's arms. We had lost so much precious time, but we were absolutely determined not to waste a single additional moment. 6 months after the arrests, my mother had recovered sufficiently to move into my home. I converted my spare bedroom into a comfortable space for her, and we established daily routines that worked beautifully for both of us. We instituted game nights every Wednesday evening, movie marathons every Sunday afternoon, and breakfast together every single morning without exception. She came to know this new version of me, the woman who had fought through absolute hell to save her, and she frequently expressed how immensely proud she was of the person I had become. Wesley was convicted on multiple felony charges and sentenced to 8 years in state prison. Crystal Dunn received 20 years in federal custody after prosecutors successfully connected her to the suspicious deaths in other states. One of those deaths was officially reclassified as homicide, based on new evidence discovered during the expanded investigation. Aunt Geraldine was never charged with any crimes, but she lost something far more valuable than freedom. She lost her entire family. No one wanted any further contact with a woman who had actively helped frame an innocent person and enable elder abuse. She eventually sold her home and relocated to a retirement community in Florida, where nobody knew her name or her shameful history. Rachel vanished from our lives completely. I heard through distant relatives that she eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, legally changed her name, and was attempting to start fresh somewhere nobody knew about her betrayal. I never received any communication from her directly, and I never made any attempt to reach out. Some betrayals are simply too profound for forgiveness, and I had no desire to pretend otherwise. The people who had supported Wesley's lies gradually faded away, and new genuine connections took their place. Uncle Howard reached out several weeks after the trial concluded. He apologized extensively for failing to recognize the truth sooner, for allowing himself to be completely manipulated by Wesley's convincing fabrications. I forgave him because his apology was obviously sincere, and because I had learned through painful experience that holding on to anger ultimately only damages the person carrying it. Life was simply too short for unnecessary grudges. And then there was Derek. Our relationship had initially been purely professional, then gradually evolved into genuine friendship during the long, difficult months of investigation. But somewhere along that journey, it transformed into something much deeper and more meaningful. He made me laugh again during a period when I had genuinely forgotten how to experience joy. He stood steadfastly beside me through the absolute worst moments of my existence without ever expecting anything in return. My mother adored him from the very first moment they were introduced. She pulled me aside one evening and told me firmly that he was a genuinely good man who had demonstrated his character by standing with me when everyone else had walked away. She instructed me not to let someone that valuable slip away. 1 year after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I hosted an entirely new celebration in my own home. The table was smaller now, but filled with people who truly mattered. My mother sat in the place of honor at the head, looking healthy and clear-eyed and fully present. Derek sat beside me, his warm hand holding mine beneath the table. Nora joined us, the brave nurse, whose courage and documentation had helped save my mother's life. Uncle Howard attended with his wife, genuinely committed to rebuilding our damaged relationship. And there were wonderful new friends as well, colleagues from my veterinary clinic and neighbors who had become like family to me. I rose to my feet and raised my glass high. I thanked everyone present for being there, for being real and genuine family. I explained that real family had nothing whatsoever to do with blood or genetic connections. Real family meant the people who actually show up when everything falls apart. Everyone around the table raised their glasses in response, and the warmth of genuine love filled the room. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the last guests had departed, I sat on my back porch with my mother. The Austin night was pleasantly warm, filled with the peaceful sound of crickets and distant wind chimes. She asked me quietly if I was truly happy now. I considered the question carefully for a long moment. A year ago, I was completely alone, publicly humiliated, and under coordinated attack from the people who should have loved me most unconditionally. Now I had rebuilt absolutely everything. Not just restored what was lost, but constructed something infinitely better and stronger. I told my mother yes. I was genuinely happy. She smiled peacefully and squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Then she asked about what Wesley had said at that Thanksgiving dinner so long ago. She asked if his cruel words still bothered me at all. I laughed softly and shook my head without hesitation. I told her Wesley had asked mockingly if I could not get a man. It turned out I never needed a man to fight my battles or win my wars. But I added that having a genuinely good partner walking beside me into the next chapter of my life was a wonderful bonus I never expected. Now I want to ask all of you watching today an important question. Have you ever been underestimated or cruelly mocked by someone who should have loved you unconditionally? Have you ever had to fight desperately for your truth when absolutely everyone around you believed lies? I want to hear your story. Please share your experience in the comments below because none of us should ever have to face these battles completely alone. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own struggles, please hit that like button right now and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are so much stronger than they realize. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell so you never miss another story of survival and triumph. Thank you so incredibly much for watching all the way until the very end. Your support and attention mean more to me than you will ever know. I wish each and every one of you strength during your difficult times, peace when the storms finally pass, and a family of people who truly have your back, whether they share your blood or not. Take good care of yourselves and each other. And always remember that no matter how dark things seem, the truth always finds a way to emerge into the light eventually.